Morning, page 554. The camp custodial staff was considered the junior command staff of the MVD. These were the Gulag non-coms, and that was the kind of assignment they had, to worry, to pray, and not let go. They were on the same Gulag ladder, only lower. As a result, they had fewer rights, and they had to use their own hands more often. However, they were not sparing of their hands, and if they were required to bloody someone up in the penalty isolator or in the jailer's room, 3 of them would boldly beat up on one, even until they had knocked him out. Year by year, they coarsened in the service, and you couldn't observe them. You couldn't observe in them the least cloudlet of pity toward the soaked, freezing, hungry, tired, and dying prisoners. In relation to them, the prisoners were just as deprived of rights and just as defenseless as in relation to the big chiefs, and they could bring pressure to bear on the prisoners in the same way and feel themselves to be high up. And they could vent their malice and display cruelty. They encountered no barriers, and when you start beating with impunity, once you've started, you don't want to stop. Tyranny incites you, and you feel yourself to be so ferocious that you are afraid even of yourself. The jailers willingly copied their officers in their conduct and in character traits too, but they didn't have that gold on their shoulder boards, and their greatcoats were dirtyish, and they went everywhere on foot, and they were not allowed prisoner servants, and they dug their own gardens, and they looked after their own farm animals. Well, of course, they did manage to haul off a zec to their places for half a day now and then, to chop wood, to wash floors. This they could do, but but not on a lavish scale, and not using the workers' X either, but those resting. Tabatarov in Berezniki in 1930 had only just lain down after a 12-hour night shift when the jailer awakened him and sent him to his house to work, and just try not to go. The jailers had no patrimonial estates. The camp, for them, after all, was not a patrimonial estate, but their service, and therefore they did not have either that arrogance or that despotic scope, and there were obstacles in the way of thievery too. This was an injustice. Even without thievery, the chiefs had plenty of money, and they could steal much too, and the custodial staff had much less, and were allowed to steal less too. No one was going to leave you a full bag from the storeroom, hardly even a small pouch. Right now I can see before my eyes, as if it were today, the big-faced, flaxen-haired Sergeant Chekhov. He came to the bookkeeping office in 1945 and ordered, "Don't issue 1 ounce of fats and oils to the Zec kitchen, only to the free employees." There were not enough fats, and this was their whole advantage. Fats according to the norm. In order to have something sewn for them in the camp's tailor shop, they had to have the camp chief's permission and wait their turn. While at work, you could make the Zecs do small tasks for you: solder, cook, hammer, sharpen something, anything larger than a stool. You'd not always manage to carry out. This limitation on thievery deeply affronted the jailers, especially their wives, and because of this, there was much bitterness against the chiefs. Because of this, life seemed very unjust, and within the jailer's breast there stirred not so much sensitive heartstrings as a sense of unfulfillment and emptiness, echoing a human groan and emptiness. And sometimes the lower-ranking jailers were capable of talking sympathetically with the Zecs, not so often, but not all that rarely either. In any case, among both the prison and camp jailers, it was possible to find human beings. Every prisoner encountered more than one in his career. In an officer, it was virtually impossible. This, properly speaking, was the universal law of the inverse ratio between social position and humaneness. The real jailers were those who had served in camp 15 and 25 years, who had once settled down in those accursed distant places, who would never be able to clamber out again. Once they had memorized his statute and daily routine, there was nothing else in their whole lives that they had to read or know, and all they did was to listen to the radio, the Moscow program number 1, and it was their chorus that constituted for us the vacantly expressionless, unwavering face of Gulag, inaccessible to any thought. Only during the war years was the composition of the jailer's staff distorted and muddied. The military authorities, in their haste, disregarded the sanctity of this custodial service and took some of them away to the front, and in place of them began to send soldiers from army units released from hospitals. But even from these they selected the stupidest and cruelest, and old men turned up as well, mobilized straight here from home. And among these grey-moustached fellows were many good-hearted, unprejudiced people. They spoke gently, searched perfunctorily, confiscated nothing, and even joked. They never registered complaints, nor reported people to be sent off to punishment cell. But after the war they were soon demobilized, and there weren't any more of them. There were unusual individuals among the jailers, in wartime too, like the student Sinin, about whom I've already written, and one other Jewish jailer in our camp at Kluge Gates, elderly, with a very civilian appearance, very calm, not fault-finding, and no one suffered misfortune from him. He was so mild in his bearing, and on one occasion I was bold enough to ask, "Tell me, what is your civilian profession?" He took not the slightest offense, looked at me with calm eyes, and quietly replied, "Merchant." During the war, before coming to our camp, he had served in Podolsk, where, as he related, 14 people have died every day of the war from starvation, and that alone makes 20,000 deaths. He evidently lasted out the war in the armies of the NKVD, and now he had to be nimble and not get stuck there for good. But take Master Sergeant Ch20, the dreaded assistant to the chief of the regiment of the Akibetsu's camp, who fitted in with the jailers just as if he had been specially cast in a mold, and as if from his diapers on he had served only there, as if he had been born along with Gulag. His was always an immobile, ominous face beneath a black forelock. It was frightening merely to be next to him or to run into him on the camp path. He would not walk past without doing a person harm, ordering him to turn back, compelling him to work, taking something away from him, scaring him, punishing him, placing him under arrest. Even after the evening roll call, when the barracks were all locked out, but in summertime, the barred windows were left open, Ch20 would creep silently up to the windows, listen there, and peer in. The whole room would be rustling, and from outside the windowsill, like a blackbird of night, he would announce punishments through the grating, not for sleeping, for talking, for not sleeping, for talking, for making or using something forbidden. All of a sudden, Ch20 disappeared for good, and the rumors swept through the camp. It was impossible to check it out. Nonetheless, such persistent rumors as this were usually correct, that he had been exposed as a fascist executor on occupied territory, that he had been arrested and received a whole court 25 years. This was in 1952. Excuse me. How had it happened, however, that a fascist executioner for no more than 3 years certainly had for 7 years after the war been in the best graces of the MPD? You tell me. The convoy opens fire without warning. This invocation encompassed the whole special statute of the convoy and its power over us on the other side of the law. convoy service, even when there was no war, was like frontline service. The convoy had nothing to fear from any investigation and did not have to give any explanations. Every convoy guard who fired was right. Every prisoner killed was guilty of wanting to escape or of stepping across the line. Take 2 murders at the Ortau camp, and you can multiply them by the total number of camps. A guard was leading a group under convoy, and a person not under convoy went up to his girlfriend in the group and walked along beside her. Move away. Is it doing you any harm? A shot killed. A comedy of a trial, and the guard was acquitted. He had been insulted while carrying out service duties. At the gatehouse, the Zek ran up to another guard with a release document. He was going to be released the next day, and asked, "Let me through. I'm going to the laundry outside the camp compound. I'll only be a minute. You can't. But tomorrow I'm going to be free, fool." The guard shot him dead, killed, and there wasn't even a trial. And how easy it was for a prisoner not to notice in the heat of his work those blazes on the trees, which constituted an imaginary dotted line, a forest cordon instead of barbed wire. For example, Solovyev, a former army lieutenant, cut down a fir tree and, moving backward, was cleaning off the branches of it. He saw only his felled tree, and a convoy guard, a Tonchayevo wolf, squinted and waited. He wouldn't call out to the Zek, "Watch out," he just waited, and Solovyev, not noticing, crossed the line of the work zone, continuing to back his way down the tree trunk. A shot, an explosive bullet, and a lung was blown apart. Solovyev was killed, and the Tonchayevo wolf got a 100-ruble prize. Tonchayevo wolves were the local inhabitants of the Tonchayevo district near Bulapalem. The local inhabitants, who had all enlisted in the VOK HR during the war, so as to be closer to home and not to go to the front. The VOK, the militarized guards, who had all enlisted in the militarized guards during the war, so as to be closer to home and not go to the front. This was the same Tonchayevo district where the children used to shout, "Mama, here comes a herring." The absoluteness in the relations between the convoy and the prisoners, this continual right of the guards to use a bullet instead of a word, could not fail to influence the character of the militarized guards, and the militarized guards enlisted them as well. The lives of the prisoners were given into their power, though not for the whole day, yet wholly and profoundly. To them, the natives were not people. They were some sort of lazy animated scarecrows whom fate had given them to count, to drive to work and from work as swiftly as possible, and to keep at work as densely crowded together as possible. But tyranny was even more intense among the officers of the militarized guards. These young whippersnappers of lieutenants had acquired a balefully despotic sensation of power over existence. Some were only loudmouthed. Senior Lieutenant Ch20 and Averbakh. Others reveled in cruelty and even let it carry over to their own soldiers, Lieutenant Samitin in the same camp. Still others did not recognize any limitations of their omnipotence. The commander of the militarized guards, Nevsky, Camp Number 3 at Ust-Vim, discovered the loss of his dog, not a service dog, but his beloved little lapdog. He went to look for it, of course, in the camp compound, and it was his luck to catch 5 natives dividing up the carcass. He pulled out his pistol and shot one dead on the spot. There were no administrative consequences of the incident, except punishment of the remaining 4 Zeks in the penalty isolator. In 1938, in the area west of the Urals, a forest fire flew with the speed of a hurricane along the Vishera River, and from the forest into 2 camps. What was to be done with the Zeks? The decision had to be made instantly. There was no time to consult with higher jurisdictions. The guards refused to release them, and they all burned to death. This was the easy way. If they had been released and escaped, the guards would have been court-martialed. There was only one limitation in the militarized guard service: on the bubbling energy of its officers. The platoon was the basic unit, and all that omnipotence came to an end above the platoon, and in rank above lieutenant. Advancement in the battalion simply had the effect of separating the officer from the actual and real power of the platoon, and was a dead-end street. As a result, the most power-hungry and most powerful of the militarized guards officers tried to leapfrog into the internal service of the MVD and to get their promotion there. Certain famous Gulag biographies consisted indeed of this. The already mentioned Antonov, the ruler of the Road of the Dead in the Arctic, had risen from a militarized guard commander, and his whole education was through the 4th grade. There is no doubt that inside the ministry, the selection of the infantry guard of the MVD was considered of great importance, and the military conscription centers had secret instructions on this. The military conscription centers conduct a great deal of secret work, yet we take a benign attitude toward them. Why, for example, has there been such a determined rejection of the Ch20's concept of territorial armies, the project of Funds? And why is it exactly to the contrary that the newly called recruits are sent with exceptional persistence to serve an army that are as far as possible from their own region? Azerbaijanians to Estonia, Latvians to the Caucasus, etc., because the armies must be alien to the local population, and preferably even of a different race, as was tested in Novocherkassk in 1962. And so, in the selection of convoy troops, there was, not without design, a higher percentage of Tatars and other minority nationalities. Their inferior education and their lack of information were valuable to the state. They were its fortress. But the real scientific organization and training of these armies only began at the same time as the special camps, the Averbakh, at the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s. They began to take only 19-year-old boys and immediately would subject them to intense ideological irradiation. We are going to discuss this convoy separately. It's a great description. But until then, it somehow seemed to be beyond their reach in Gulag. The truth was that not all our people, even those socialists, had yet risen to the steadfast, cruel level necessary for a worthy camp guard. The militarized guard staff was uneven and ceased to be the wall of horror it was intended to be. It softened up, especially in the years of the Soviet-German War, the very best trained in good viciousness, and the young fellows had to be surrendered to the front, and sickly reservists were dragged into the military guard, too unhealthy to be suitable for the active army, and too untrained in viciousness for Gulag. They were not brought up in the right years. In the most mercilessly hungry war years in camp, this relaxation of the militarized guard, wherever it took place, and it didn't take place everywhere, at least partially ease the life of the prisoners. Nina Samshul recollects her father, who in 1942 was called up into the army at an advanced age and sent to serve as guard in Camp Archangel province. His family joined him there. At home, my father spoke bitterly about life in camp and about the good people who were there. When my papa had to guard a brigade all by himself at a prison farm, this too was wartime. One guard for the whole brigade. Wasn't that a relaxation? I often went to see him there, and he allowed me to talk with the prisoners. The prisoners had a lot of respect for my father. He was never rude to them, and he let them go to the store, for example, when they asked, and they never tried to escape from him. They said to me, now if only all the convoy guards were like your father. He knew that many innocents had been imprisoned, and he was always indignant, but only at home. In the platoon he could say nothing. They imprisoned people for that. At the end of the war he was immediately demobilized. But one cannot consider Samshel a typical wartime model. His subsequent fate shows it. In 1947, he himself was arrested under Article 58, and in 1950 he was released because he was dying and allowed to return home, where he died 5 months later. After the war, this loose sort of guarding still lasted a year or two, and it somehow began to happen that many of the militarized guards also began to talk of their service as their sentence. When I finished my sentence, they understood the shame of their service, the kind of service you could not talk about to the family at home. In the same Ortal, one convoy guard intentionally stole something from the cultural and educational section and was dismissed from the service and convicted and immediately amnestied, and the other guards envied him. He had found the way, smart boy. And Stolyarova recalls a guard who caught her at the beginning of an escape attempt and concealed her attempt, and she was not punished. One other shot himself out of love for Zechka, sent off on a prisoner transport. Before the introduction of real severities in the women's camps, friendly, good, yes, and even loving relations between the women prisoners and the convoy guards had often begun. Not even our great state had managed to stamp out goodness and love everywhere. Yet the young reinforcements of the post-war years also did not become immediately what Gulag had wanted them to be. When a member of the Neroblag infantry guards, Vladan Zadorny, mutinied, we will have to say more about him. We will have more to say about him. His mates in the service, who were of his age, took a very sympathetic attitude toward his resistance. Self-guarding constitutes a special area in the history of the camp guard. Back indeed, in the post-revolutionary years, it was proclaimed that self-watch was a duty of Soviet prisoners. This was employed at Solovki, not without success, and very widely on the White Sea-Baltic Canal and on the Moscow-Volga Canal. Every socially friendly prisoner who did not wish to push a wheelbarrow could take up a rifle against his comrades. We will not affirm that this was a special diabolical plan for the moral disintegration of the people. As always, in a half-century of our most recent modern history, a lofty, bright theory and creeping moral vileness somehow got naturally interwoven and were easily transformed into one another. But from the stories of the old sects, it had become known that the prisoner trusty guards were cruel to their own brothers, strove to curry favor and hold on to their dogs' duties, and sometimes settled old accounts with a bullet on the spot. And this had also been noted in our literature on jurisprudence. In many cases, those who were deprived of freedom carried out their duties of guarding the colonies and maintaining order better than the staff jailers. And so tell me, what bad is there that one cannot teach a nation, or people, or all of humanity? That particular quotation came from the 30s, and Zadorny confirms it as being also true for the end of the 40s. The trusty guards were vicious towards their comrades, usually used formal reasons for entrapment and shot them. and in Parma, the penalty expedition of Averbakh. The only prisoners were the 58s, and the trusty guards were also 58s, politicals. Vladimir tells about the trusty guard Kuzma, a former chauffeur, a young fellow with little more than 20 years old. In 1949, he had received a tenner for 5810. How was he to survive? He could find no other way. In 1952, Vladimir found him working as a trusty guard. The situation tormented him, and he said he could not bear the burden of his rifle. When he went out on guard duty, he often didn't load it. At night he wept, calling himself a mercenary coward, and even wanted to shoot himself. He had a high forehead and a nervous face. He loved verses, and went off with Vladimir into the taiga to recite them. And then again, he used to take up his rifle. And he knew a trusty guard named Alexander Lunin, who was already well along in years, whose grey locks formed a wreath about his forehead, and who had a kind, good-natured smile. In the war, he had been an infantry lieutenant, and then the chairman on the collective farm. He had received a tenner under a non-political article because he had refused to give in to the demands of the district party committee, and had arranged distributions to the collective farms on his own, which meant he was that kind of man. His neighbors were dearer to him than he himself was. And there in Averbakh he became a trusty guard, and even earned a reduction in his term from the chief of the Solzhenitsyn camp. The bounds of a human being, no matter how you are astounded by them, you can never comprehend. Have a good day.